Kaydee was alone in Shadow's nest, then her adorable reaction revealed something new. For weeks, almost every question about Kaydee has involved Shadow. Why does she keep following him? Why does she keep returning to the same trees? Why does she call when he is nearby? Why does she keep visiting the nest he shared with Jackie for so many years? And perhaps the biggest question of all, is Kaydee returning to Big Bear because of Shadow? But on one quiet morning, Shadow wasn't standing beside her. Kaydee was alone. She entered the familiar nest, looked around the habitat, and for a few minutes seemed completely occupied with exploring the space on her own. Then something caught her attention. The camera Kaydee looked toward it. She tilted her head, then tilted it again. For viewers watching from the other side of that lens, the moment was almost impossible not to smile at. It looked curious, playful, maybe even a little confused. But we have to be careful with those words. We cannot know exactly what Kaydee was thinking. We cannot know whether she understood that thousands of people were watching her. And we certainly cannot assume she was deliberately performing for the camera. What we can say is much more interesting. Kaydee noticed something unfamiliar enough to investigate, and she did it while Shadow was nowhere beside her. That may seem like a tiny detail, but perhaps this quiet, adorable moment tells us something we have been overlooking. Because if Kaydee only cared about following Shadow, what was she doing alone in the nest? Maybe the next chapter of this story isn't only about Kaydee's growing interest in Shadow. Maybe it is also about Kaydee becoming comfortable enough to explore Big Bear for herself. And that changes the mystery. When Kaydee first appeared in the Big Bear area, almost everything about her was unfamiliar. The landscape was new, the nest was new, the familiar lookout trees were new, Shadow was new, and for viewers, Kaydee herself was the mystery. She was a young bald eagle with a recognizable band and a history that could be traced to Southern California. But no one knew whether her appearance in Big Bear would last longer than a few hours. Young eagles explore. They wander between suitable habitats. They investigate lakes, forests, feeding opportunities and territories occupied by other eagles. Kaydee could easily have done the same. She could have arrived, rested, eaten, and continued somewhere else. Instead, she returned again and again. At first, those returns seemed closely connected to Shadow. Kaydee appeared around trees Shadow used. She shared areas of the territory with him. She vocalized near him. Sometimes when Shadow moved, Kaydee appeared to move in the same direction soon afterward. Friends of Big Bear Valley even joked that Shadow has a shadow after Kaydee followed him, only seconds after he left a perch. Friends of Big Bear Valley 3, the behavior naturally created a relationship story, but relationships are only one part of an animal's world. An eagle also learns places, and Kaydee has been learning Big Bear. The nest may be the clearest example. For viewers, this nest has years of history attached to it. Jackie, Shadow, eggs, eaglets, storms, food deliveries, nest rebuilding. Thousands of hours of life captured by cameras. But Kaydee does not arrive with that human history. To her, the nest is a physical structure inside a potentially useful eagle territory. A large platform, a high location, a place overlooking habitat. Something worth inspecting. One visit would tell us almost nothing, but repeated visits begin to tell us something else. Kaydee knows where the nest is now, and she can return to it without Shadow leading her there. That distinction matters, because there is a difference between following another eagle into a place and learning how to find that place yourself on this particular morning. Kaydee arrived at the nest alone. She looked around. She observed the surrounding habitat. Then her attention shifted toward the camera, according to reports describing the footage. She appeared to inspect the camera dome closely, tilting her head from one side to the other as she studied it. To us, it looks adorable, and it is, but biologically. The behavior may be even more fascinating than the emotional reaction it creates in viewers. Raptors depend heavily on vision. Their eyes are highly specialized for detecting detail and judging distance. Bald eagles can shift between different visual strategies, and head position helps them bring objects into useful parts of their visual field. when an eagle turns or cocks its head while studying something. That movement can help it inspect the object from another visual angle. So when Kaydee tilted her head toward the camera, she may not have been confused in the human sense. She may simply have been gathering information. What is that object? Does it move? Is it important? Does it belong here? We cannot know the exact question inside an eagle's mind, but the behavior shows attention. And attention tells us that Kaydee was actively examining her environment. That brings us to something very important about animal psychology. Curiosity is often described casually, but in wild animals, it can have real survival value. A young animal needs to distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar objects. Something new might represent danger, or food, or another animal, or simply something irrelevant. Investigating the environment helps reduce uncertainty, and young animals, especially those exploring new habitats, can benefit enormously from learning what belongs in the landscape around them. That may be one reason Kaydee's camera encounter feels so different from the other footage we have watched. There is no shadow interaction to interpret, no question about courtship, no obvious territorial challenge. It is simply Kaydee learning, and perhaps that allows us to see her personality, or, more cautiously, her behavioral tendencies more clearly. She approaches, she looks, she investigates, she stays long enough to gather information. Then she moves on. Those traits fit surprisingly well with everything else we have watched her do in Big Bear. Think about her recent history. Kaydee did not arrive and remain on one branch she explored. She found familiar perch trees. She visited the nest. She spent time in the roosting area. She moved around Shadow's territory. And whenever the cameras found her again, she seemed to be adding another location to the map. Now she is investigating the camera itself. Maybe that tiny head tilt belongs to the same larger pattern. Kaydee appears willing to investigate unfamiliar things. That does not tell us why she is staying. But it may help explain how she is becoming comfortable so quickly. There is a psychological concept that becomes useful here, although we should use it carefully. Animals constantly balance two tendencies. Avoid what may be dangerous. Investigate what may be useful. Too much fear and an animal may miss opportunities. Too little caution and it may expose itself to unnecessary risk. Kaydee's behavior around Big Bear appears to contain both confidence and observation. She does not simply crash into every new situation. She watches, she approaches, she evaluates. At the camera, that evaluation happened in a way humans found funny. But from Kaydee's perspective, it may have been a very serious visual inspection. And this may help explain why so many viewers are becoming attached to her. We are not simply seeing another eagle. We are watching a young eagle learn. There is another detail worth considering. Kaydee was alone. That matters because so much of her recent behavior has been interpreted through Shadow. If Shadow is in the tree and Kaydee lands nearby, we ask about Shadow. If they call, we ask about their relationship. If Kaydee follows him, we ask whether a bond is developing. But remove Shadow from the frame, and Kaydee still has a story. She still visits the nest. She still studies the environment. She still chooses where to perch. She still interacts with Big Bear independently. That tells us something important. Even if Shadow is part of the reason Kaydee keeps returning, he may not be the only reason. Big Bear itself may now matter. This is where the morning becomes even more interesting. Later, Shadow appeared on one familiar perch, while Kaydee was nearby on another. Then Shadow took flight. Only seconds later, Kaydee followed. That sequence gives us both sides of the story in one morning. Kaydee alone, exploring independently. Then Kaydee near Shadow, following him again. Maybe the mistake is assuming one explanation has to eliminate the other. Perhaps Kaydee can be interested in Shadow and interested in the territory. Perhaps her growing familiarity with Big Bear makes following Shadow easier. And perhaps following Shadow teaches her more about Big Bear. Those two processes could reinforce each other. Shadow knows this territory extremely well, where he perches, where he roosts, where he flies, where food is available, where the nest sits. A young eagle spending time around him does not need to be consciously taking lessons for information to become available. Watching another animal can reveal opportunities. Following movement can reveal new locations. And repeated exposure gradually transforms an unfamiliar landscape into something recognizable. This gives us a new way to think about Kaydee's behavior. Maybe she is not simply Shadow's shadow. Maybe Shadow is part of Kaydee's map. That is a very different idea. When Shadow moves, Kaydee sometimes follows. But when he isn't there, Kaydee continues exploring. She does not appear to switch off until he returns. She investigates the nest. She watches the environment. She notices the camera. And then, when Shadow appears again, the social part of the story resumes. That combination may be much more important than either behavior alone. What does this tell us about Kaydee's psychology? Only what behavior allows us to say. She appears attentive. She appears willing to explore. She recognizes and revisits locations. She reacts to visual stimuli, and she continues seeking proximity to Shadow. We should stop there. We cannot say she feels lonely when he leaves. We cannot say she is waiting for him. We cannot say she views the nest as her future home, and we cannot say she has already formed a permanent attachment. Those interpretations may feel emotionally satisfying, but they go beyond what the footage proves. Still, caution does not make the story less interesting. It makes the mystery better, because what we can see is already remarkable. A young eagle who could be wandering anywhere continues choosing the same landscape. And inside that landscape, she is becoming increasingly confident. Consider how different Kaydee behaves from the very first image viewers had of her. At the beginning, she was an outsider. Every appearance was surprising. Now people know where to look. The nest, twin pines, the roost, the lookout snags. And increasingly, Kaydee seems to know those places too. That is how familiarity develops. Not through one dramatic decision, through repetition, a tree visited twice, then again, a nest inspected once, then revisited, a resident eagle encountered repeatedly, a camera noticed. Another part of the environment added to the mental map. Eventually, the question stops being, does Kaydee know this place? Of course she does. The question becomes, how important has this place become? That is something future footage may help answer. Suppose Shadow disappears from the cameras for most of a day. Does Kaydee remain around Big Bear? Does she visit the nest? Does she use the same perch trees? Does she call? Does she continue exploring? If she does, that would strengthen the idea that her connection is not entirely dependent on Shadow. Now imagine the opposite. Shadow leaves the area, and Kaydee immediately follows him every time. That would suggest the social relationship deserves even more attention. These comparisons will matter. And perhaps this morning has already given us the first small version of that experiment. Shadow wasn't at the nest. Kaydee went anyway. That is the clue I think many viewers may miss, because the camera moment is so cute. The head tilts steal the scene, but behind them is something more significant. Kaydee is comfortable enough to occupy the nest alone. Not necessarily comfortable in an emotional sense, comfortable in a behavioral sense. She enters, she stands, she observes. She investigates. She does not need Shadow physically beside her to interact with the site. That may represent a quiet change from the earliest days of her visits. And then, of course, there is the camera. For years, humans have watched Big Bear's eagles through that lens. Jackie looked past it. Shadow lived beneath it. Eaglets grew up beside it. The camera became part of the landscape for viewers. Now Kaydee has discovered it too. There is something strangely symbolic about that moment. A new eagle enters an old nest, and for a moment seems to stare directly back at the audience watching her. Again, she does not understand the story humans are attaching to that moment, but we do, and perhaps that is why people responded so strongly. After weeks filled with loss, uncertainty, and questions about Shadow's future, Kaydee gave viewers something completely different, a simple moment of curiosity. No crisis, no confrontation, no prediction, just a young eagle turning her head and examining something new. Sometimes wildlife does not need drama. Sometimes personality emerges through the smallest movement. But even that word personality needs context. Animals do show consistent individual differences in behavior. Some individuals are more exploratory, some more cautious, some more reactive. But determining an animal's personality scientifically requires repeated observations across situations. One adorable camera inspection cannot define Kaydee, yet it gives us something to compare with future behavior. Does she frequently investigate unusual objects? Does she approach changes in the nest? Does she inspect new branches? Does she react strongly when something unfamiliar appears? Over time, those observations could reveal whether the curiosity viewers think they see is actually a stable behavioral pattern. That is the exciting part. We now have a hypothesis, not a conclusion, and perhaps that should become the way we watch Kaydee from now on. Not only, where is Shadow, but what is Kaydee learning today? Maybe she explores a different tree. Maybe she studies another bird. Maybe she returns to the camera. Maybe she rearranges something in the nest. Maybe she simply sits quietly and watches the lake. Every one of those behaviors can tell us something about how a young eagle becomes familiar with a landscape. And if Kaydee stays, we may be witnessing the earliest stage of a transformation that normally happens without anyone seeing it. As visitor, explorer, familiar presence, and perhaps eventually resident, we are not at that last stage, but the possibility is becoming harder to ignore. There is also an emotional dimension viewers will naturally feel. Kaydee is entering a territory shaped by Jackie's history that creates complicated reactions. Some people may be excited. Some may still feel uncomfortable seeing another eagle in the nest. Some may see hope. Others may simply want nature to unfold without attaching expectations. All of those human reactions are understandable, but Kaydee does not carry that emotional burden. She is simply being an eagle, and perhaps the camera moment is valuable precisely because it reminds us of that. Kaydee is not a symbol, not a replacement, not a character written to complete Shadow's story. She is an individual animal exploring her own world. If a relationship with Shadow eventually develops, that will be part of her story, but not the whole story. And this brings us back to the title we originally imagined for this chapter. Kaydee found Shadow again, but what happened when he didn't stay? The answer may be more interesting than expected. Kaydee didn't stop being interesting when Shadow left the frame. She continued exploring, she continued interacting with the territory. Then, when Shadow appeared later and eventually flew away, Kaydee followed him again. So perhaps this is not a story about Kaydee waiting for Shadow. It is a story about Kaydee learning two things at once, a place and another eagle. One may eventually matter more than the other, or they may become inseparable parts of the same future. We do not know. The next few weeks could reveal much more. Watch what Kaydee does when she is alone. Those moments may become increasingly valuable. When Shadow is present, his behavior naturally influences the scene. When he is absent, Kaydee makes every visible choice herself. Where does she go? How long does she stay? What catches her attention? What does she investigate? Does she return? Those are the moments that may tell us whether Big Bear is becoming part of Kaydee's routine independent of Shadow. And if that happens, the entire story changes. Because a young eagle who follows a resident male is one thing. A young eagle who learns his territory, uses it alone, returns repeatedly, and then continues seeking his company is something much more interesting. So perhaps the most important moment from that morning was not when Kaydee followed Shadow. It may have happened earlier when no other eagle was beside her. When she stood inside the nest and noticed something strange watching from above, she looked at it, tilted her head, then looked again. For viewers, it was adorable. For Kaydee, it may simply have been another piece of Big Bear to understand. And that small distinction tells us exactly why this story is worth following. We keep asking whether Kaydee belongs with Shadow, but maybe another question has been quietly developing underneath it. Is Kaydee beginning to feel familiar enough with Big Bear that she no longer needs Shadow beside her to explore it? We cannot know what she feels, but we can watch what she does. And right now, what she keeps doing is remarkably consistent. She returns, she explores, she learns, she finds Shadow again. And then she comes back for another day. Maybe that is the sweetest clue of all.